This lecture concerns the New England colonies, which we started talking about today in class. So we talked about the southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, etc. And this map is just showing you when we relate the three sections of colonies, southern, middle, and New England, we see that obviously the southern colonies have the most fertile land, which is why they are going to focus on agriculture. There are sections of the middle colony that have very fertile land and sections that have somewhat fertile, so they're kind of going to be a mix. But the least fertile land is going to be New England, which will make them not focus on agriculture. Even after the Puritans kind of dissipate and we get more people in New England, because it's going to be the most populated area, we'll see the most cities there. We will start to see that they're not going to focus on agriculture because their land is not as fertile. So what does New England encompass? It encompasses the current states, or present-day states of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. This area is known for good harbors and natural harbors, which we talked about in class the other day. The idea that the harbors and ports are naturally deep, so we could get big boats in there. They had pieces of land that made kind of bays, and they could have calm water. They will farm, but they will do subsistence farming, and they will start with just small farms and towns. What that tells you is there's no need for slavery up here, or a very minimal need. The trade centered around these harbors, so what is eventually going to happen is the cash crops of tobacco or cotton are going to be produced in the southern and middle colonies. They're going to be sent up north to the New England colonies, and they're going to be shipped out of here because of the harbors. It is hilly, it is forested, and there is shallow soil, so again, they're not going to be able to grow very much. Major cities are Boston, specifically, which is going to have a large population. Besides trade, they're going to get involved in fishing, lumber production of these forests, and trapping. Family, religion, and community are going to be keys, and you can see that there's a lot of different towns that pop up here, but they're quite close to each other, and they're quite... even in the town, there's a lot of people in small areas. That's going to change their society. You're going to have to rely on people because they are so close to you, so there's going to be far more close-knit societies up here than places like in the South, where your nearest neighbor was several miles away. So as we mentioned, there's kind of three groups that make up what people call Puritans or Pilgrims. The Pilgrims are the original travelers to New England, to Massachusetts Bay. They are also known as separatists. They're the ones who wanted to separate from the Church of England because they didn't believe they could fix it. Puritans believed that they could purify it. Eventually, they're both kind of going to be removed from England and moved to New England, and they will kind of merge. The communities are very well organized. These are highly educated people. They have established towns. We get the idea of the Protestant work ethic, which was really hard work, a good day's work, and that still kind of sticks with Americans today. And the idea of family values, that the family is very important, and that kind of comes from the religious conservatism that both of these groups, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, or Separatists, all practiced. So, as they start to build the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we start to see the formations of a government, and it's a little bit different than what we saw in Jamestown. Jamestown had that representative democracy, and it was very classist. It was really about the rich continuing to have their power like they did back home in England. Massachusetts Bay is going to be different. They had a town government where all property-owning males could vote in these town meetings where they discussed issues. But since they all came over relatively, or many of them came over relatively wealthy, there's going to be a lot more democracy here because a lot more people are going to own property and be able to have vote. So it was much closer to democracy than the republic or the representative democracy down in Jamestown. So this is where we're eventually going to meld these two ideas of a really democratic government like Massachusetts Bay and a representative government in Jamestown, and eventually these things are going to be formed into our current government. So, since the idea of government was to enforce God's laws, according to Puritans, religious leaders like John Cotton or John Winthrop were very influential and often became governors or mayors. The clergy were barred from formal political office, so you had to give up being a clergy, and we started to see church and state separation, but they were very, very influential, even if they were still sitting clergy. So ironically, when they start forming these communities, they do not practice any sort of toleration of religion at first. Again, kind of ironic because they were persecuted in their homeland, which is why they left in the first place, but they don't tolerate other religions. So this is different from some place like Maryland, that as long as you were Christian, you were okay. Separatists were trying to get away from other people that they thought were less Christian than them, even if they considered themselves Christians. So very different in terms of toleration, at least at the beginning. And there are two major incidents during the first half of the 17th century as they're forming their colony that demonstrated their Puritan religious intolerance. The first deals with a man named Roger Williams. He is a teacher in the Salem Bay settlement, and he taught a number of controversial principles. First of all, he teaches that church and state should be completely separate. Now, again, we said that the clergy could not be members of the town council in Puritan society, but they did have influence. Roger Williams wants them to have no influence. He actually challenged the charter of Massachusetts Bay because he believed it illegally was taking land from the Indians. The Puritans and the Separatists don't believe the Indians are worthy of land because they are not kind of God's children. They're not Christians. So this is a not popular idea with Puritans. So eventually, Williams is removed or banished from the colony, and he moves to modern-day Rhode Island and founds a new colony in 1636. And he's actually aided by the Native Americans that are locally there. Rhode Island's charter allowed for the free exercise of religion, so kind of an idea that we eventually used in the First Amendment to the Constitution, and it does not require voters to be church members as they did in Puritan society in Massachusetts Bay. So we're seeing Puritans, when we disagree with somebody, we kick them out. The second major issue that we see in Puritan society comes from a lady named Anne Hutchinson. She believed in this idea of antinomianism, which is the belief that faith and God's grace, as opposed to observance of moral law and performance of good deeds, was enough to get someone to be part of the elected few that was going to get into heaven. So basically, as long as you were a good person and believed in God, you got into heaven, which was kind of a very Lutheran teaching. However, Puritans believed you had to show that you were a good person by performing good deeds and following the law. So her teachings challenged Puritan belief and the authority of the Puritan clergy. Puritan clergy were all male, and she would actually teach local women or local men, too, in her own home, which was against the law, and it kind of challenged the authority of these people. So she was an intelligent and well-educated, powerful woman in a very patriarchal society run by man, was turning a lot of people against her. Women were not supposed to do this. She is eventually tried for heresy, a crime against the church, and speaking out against the church. During the trial, she is able to kind of confound a lot of the Puritan clergymen, and towards the end of the trial, she actually comes down with a bad fever, so bad that she was not able to really defend herself towards the end, so she's eventually convicted, and she is banished as well. So you're seeing Roger Williams and Hutchinson, both the same issues. You disagree with Puritan beliefs, and you are going to be removed. So they're very, very elitist and exclusive groupings here. Unlike other colonies that were accepting anybody who would work, they're not looking to make money. They're looking to create kind of a new Eden, a perfect place for Christianity and their specific version of Christianity to flourish. So we start to see, as the population goes here, very similar to areas in the South, at least in terms of white and Native American populations. We see by 1640 the white population is starting to explode, and the Native American population is starting to decrease exponentially, and we can kind of guess why that happens. But you also see very limited black population, lack of slaves being necessary, and you can see towards the end of that chart, as we approach the American Revolution, we're getting more African Americans up there, but most of those are either slaves that maybe have earned their freedom or escaped slaves, and they would not necessarily, they weren't necessarily slaves, even though they were black in the colonies, because they went to New England, so they weren't really in need of them. It wasn't that they weren't racist or didn't include some of the ideas that the Southerners had about African Americans. It's simply that they didn't need many slaves because they weren't doing that type of agriculture. So you can see a little bit different than the southern colonies. You see the four main colonies here, and Massachusetts is the first one, and it becomes Massachusetts Bay. And all of the colonies that come after were formed from Massachusetts, so they kind of break off. We talked about Roger Williams in Rhode Island. All of them are kind of founded for religious freedom, except maybe New Hampshire, which was more about maybe setting up some trade opportunity, because as we get to the 1670s and 1680s, we start to see a different group moving over to Massachusetts Bay. But you can see at first, Massachusetts is owned kind of by the proprietors, by the Puritans. Eventually, it becomes a royal colony. Rhode Island is owned a self-governing colony. Eventually, it'll become a royal colony. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, they found their own self-governing colony. Eventually, that's going to become a royal colony. And in New Hampshire, by we get to the 1670s, is founded as a royal colony by the King of England, when you're starting to see that change from privately owned colonies to colonies owned by the English crown. So even though New England gets started later than Virginia in that area, it gets populated far more quickly. You can see just on the map that compared to the southern colonies, there's far more towns and cities that develop at this point in Massachusetts Bay and the surrounding colonies compared to the South, because the South is focused on farming, so they need more space and more spread out. So Hartford, Connecticut was actually founded by Dutch and English settlers, so they kind of worked together in Connecticut. Some Puritans moved westward to Connecticut with Thomas Hooker, and that was mostly because they were looking for some religious freedom from Massachusetts, because they were so kind of fundamentalist. In 1639, Connecticut writes the Fundamental Orders, which is the kind of the first modern constitution written in the colonies, and it establishes a democratic government, so they're writing that down. 1641, New Hampshire is taken over by overly aggressive Massachusetts Bay Colony, and annoyed by the greed of the Bay Colony, the king separates it and says it's a royal colony. So we saw how that becomes a royal colony. Again, eventually all of these are going to become royal colonies, but the king is starting to see by 1679 that maybe these colonies are becoming too powerful for themselves, and he needs to kind of rein in the power. So far it's kind of looked like Massachusetts was very different than the southern colonies, and they were in a lot of ways. But as more and more settlers start to move to Massachusetts Bay, they start looking for new places, specifically Connecticut. They have a fertile region with lots of access for trade, as you see the Connecticut River there. That's why Hartford, the current capital of the state of Connecticut, is built there. However, very much like the southern colonies, there are already people who were living there known as the Pequots, who resisted the English incursions, just like as Powhatan and the Powhatan Confederacy in Jamestown starts to realize that maybe there's too many English people coming over here. The Pequots are going to try to fight back as well, and unfortunately for them, much like the Powhatans, it's going to be the same result. So as more and more English are moving, the Pequots attack a settlement in Wakefield, and they kill 9 colonists. So members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony retaliated by burning the main Pequot village and killing 400 Native Americans, many of them women and children. So again, they're not going to be fair with this. You kill 9 of ours, we're going to kill 400 because we want to wipe you out. The result was the near destruction of the Pequots and what became known as the Pequot War, but they will not be able to stand up to the English because of their superior weapons. And the English, kind of like in Jamestown, they're entrenched. They're there. They're not really going anywhere, and it's too little too late by the time the Pequots start to fight back. So as we start to compare New England and the Chesapeake southern colonies, we realize that there's some major differences. So entire families went to New England because they were going for religious reasons, not necessarily to make money. In the Chesapeake, it was mostly single males. The population's not going to grow as quickly in the Chesapeake as it is going to grow in New England. Climate in New England was more hospitable because it's more similar to what the English were used to. So they lived longer and had larger families than the Chesapeake residents, because the Chesapeake's, again, residents are doing more work and working very hard. There's a strong sense of community in New England, so they make large towns, and they're like closer to one another kind of emotionally or socially, but they're also literally closer to one another. The Chesapeake had smaller, more spread out communities. Tobacco is the cash crop, so you need a lot of land. They don't get to know their neighbors, so they're less likely to get help or grow strong communities. So again, there are some similarities. They both have conflicts with natives, and they're going to win against the natives. There are democratic traditions. Where they both have some sort of democratic type government, a little more democracy in New England than in the southern colonies. And that conflict with natives, you see the picture on the left, is that first Thanksgiving. They don't start as conflict with natives, just like in Virginia. Different environments lead to difference in the economy. New England's not going to focus on agriculture, and the key role of religion and family is very different than that in the Chesapeake. And you can see just by this map, very different comparison between the two and how the communities develop and who goes there.